My topic was, what can comic book authors do to attract the attention of women readers, as they are the fastest growing group of comic book readers currently. This kind of threw me for a loop because I've been reading comics since I was maybe 6 or 7. I would always go in the Milwaukee Journal Sentinel, the Sunday edition, and I would always flip straight to the comics. And they were usually along the lines of like Peanuts or Foxtrot, you know, the typical brother-sister fights and just little kid situations. And since I was so little, you know, I could always relate to that, and they would always make me laugh. I never noticed any of the things that Mr. Javier pointed out in his presentation. I never noticed representation. I never noticed color, and I just always found these really hilarious. So when I was given this topic, it threw me for a loop, and I decided to ask my Facebook friends, both genders, all races, everything, and one of the first points I got was more realism. Does anyone else notice that a lot of these female characters are maybe my size or maybe a little bigger, and they have perfectly nipped in waists and just lots of assets and yeah. And as Javier also said, they're usually not the superhero. They're usually in distress. They usually need to be saved. That ties into my second point as well. One person mentioned to me that they'd like to see a reversal of roles. So rather than the man swooping in to save the woman, maybe have the woman swoop in to save the man. I've thought of that myself, but never thought it could be like an actual comic or an actual movie or anything like that. So let's see. My third point here would be to stick to intense storylines and highlight underrated people. Some comics, you'll notice, they will go off into tangents or pick up on an entirely different subject, and you're left saying, wait a minute, what just happened? Sometimes the connections aren't very good, and sometimes, like we just said, the underrated people are not highlighted. I will never forget, it's probably the summer before last, or maybe it was even last summer. My husband and I, we took a trip to Madison. We have friends in Madison, and they took us to a comic book store. I don't remember the name of it at the moment, but I saw one comic book with the author Zora Neale Hurston as the subject, and it was called Fire, the story of Zora Neale Hurston. I didn't have the money for it at the time, but I was like, oh wow, I'm gonna have to get that at some point. I feel she's a very underrated author. Usually, if she's mentioned, people mention her biggest book, Their Eyes Were Watching God. And that makes me feel like saying that I'm pretty sure she has more books in print, and I'm sure that she wrote more than about just trying to keep the faith as you're going through a tough struggle. So, let's see, that leads to another point here. Someone else mentioned a modern day twist on fairy tales, like Sleeping Beauty or Snow White. Maybe those people could actually go to save the prince, tying into my third point from before. Or maybe they could actually be trying to save people from despair and stress. Let's see. Another big point that was brought up to me was to be more kid-friendly, or to show comic books as an introduction to reading, or more inclusive of people of color. A friend of mine has 3 kids, I believe it is, and she's actually introducing her oldest daughter. She has a 5-year-old. She is introducing her oldest daughter to reading through comic books, and I thought, that's actually a really unique idea. I don't know if my parents did the same, because a lot of comics just deal with some type of distress or some type of worldly disaster, and they actually may not be appropriate for children. So when my friend brought that idea up to me, I was like, oh hey, that's actually a really good idea. Another point that was brought up to me is length. Sometimes some comics are really too short for people. Like, they'll go and they'll buy maybe a $5 comic book and it's only maybe 10 or 12 pages long. I'd be awfully disappointed with that, but most of my collections are like these, and I have one that's actually called Too Much Coffee Man, and surprisingly that collection is about 700 pages. So when she brought that point up to me, I was like, really? But I do understand some comics are actually just really thin, and then you see the price and you go, "But what? I'm paying that much for just a thin little thing." So yeah, that would basically be it. I'm surprised I only took up 5 minutes. If you guys have questions or like want to elaborate, I guess I could take 5 minutes for that. Anyone? Yeah.
There's a book called Princess. I'm not sure if they're still coming out with new ones. Princeless. It's gender bent princess saving knights.
Okay.
Basically. Well, princess saving other princesses, and it's really good.
Okay.
Highly recommend one. Princess.
Okay, that's a good one. Yep.
Well, I think what you want connects really nicely to what Zach talked about is, because I think some of those things, I think those are things that definitely need to be addressed in like mainstream comics, but you know, when you have independent comics, anyone can make a comic. It doesn't cost a lot of money, and you know, if we can unlock that art form to more and more people, and more people printed, got their stuff printed at Indie Planet, you get so many different people, you know, getting their message out there and addressing some of those things like, you know, could there be more comics for kids or
For sure,
more
yeah.
comics for anyone?
Yeah.
Insert group here.
That's awesome. That's awesome. Anyone else?
In a lot of the independent women comics, like the Neil Ferris, one of my favorites, as everybody who comes to the meetings knows, is my favorite thing is Monsters by Neil Ferris. And the comics that women write tend to be what you're saying. They're longer, there's more narrative, there's more talking, and it's all the things that women want out of comics. So
Right.
if you search out the female artists and writers, they're the ones that are going to make you happy.
Great. Okay. Anyone else?
Yeah, like along those same lines, it took me like a long time to realize, like, you know, when I started reading comics as probably a preteen, like I realized like sometimes I like Wonder Woman and sometimes I don't. And then I realized like later, like, oh, well, you know, it's like it's the writer and it's the male writer who like is not like
Not getting it.
getting my experience in the world. So yeah, I mean, it took me a long time to like realize like, oh, it's not all the same writer.
Oh wow. Anyone else?
I think I would add that's probably the most difficult thing for new readers in general is understanding how to start, because it's just this like it's not necessarily a guide. You go into a comic shop and it's even in a Barnes and Noble, it's not clear where to start, and the vast majority of it is not very good, honestly. And so like, and when it's true that you can't even follow a character over a long period of time and know that, oh, this character is one I like, because it's learning that you have to follow a creative team and then finding where that creative team is writing and what time and what year.
Bounces a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've definitely left a comic shop with like 3 or 4 different artists and 3 or 4 different subjects.
Yeah, and I wonder that more shops don't organize things just by the creator, as opposed to like Marvel and the characters, because Al Ewing's a perfect example. Like, whatever characters you're going with, like he's writing good stuff.
Right. One thing I'd like to point out too is like I don't know if Collector's Edge is still doing it, but I know at one point Collector's Edge was having like, you know, ladies' night like every couple of months. Well, honest to God, it was just like, you know, no dudes allowed in the shop tonight. So, you know, we've got our women employees are working tonight. If you feel uncomfortable normally coming into a comic book shop because you got weird dudes, you know, being weird dudes, this is the night to come into the comic book shop. I thought it was a pretty cool idea.
That's pretty cool. Anyone else?
Any other comments or questions for Myra? Oh, cool. Well, thank you, Myra.